Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, we're continuing our journey through the testing countryside. Last week, I gave you a good overview of unit testing with XUnit and how to test Blazor components with BUnit. We also got our first look at snapshot testing, which compares the output of a component to a known output. Well, this week, we're taking snapshot testing to another level using a tool called Reverify. So I've invited the inventor of Reverify, Simon Kropp, to show it off today. Spoiler alert, you're moving up to first class. And that's all coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. Okay, I'm very, very excited because Simon Kropp is here, and Simon has been on .NET Rocks before talking about lots of things. Extending C# was the last one. And he actually submitted a pull request to Blazor Sliders, which was a few episodes ago, putting in tests and documentation, automatically generating documentation. And it was at a fortuitous time, Simon, because I was just doing the unit testing stuff, testing 101 for Blazor Train, which was last week. So it turned out to be a really good thing because you brought not only XUnit and BUnit to the party, but Reverify, which is a tool that you wrote, which I want to talk about first, and also Playwright, .NET, and a couple other things. So we're going to build on what we talked about last week. And I'm just going to let Simon take it away with Reverify. What is it and why do we need it?
Well, thanks for having me on the show. So Reverify is a snapshot testing library for .NET, and it focuses on streamlining taking the snapshots of a variety of different sources and then helping you compare those snapshots with existing snapshots. So you have an incoming snapshot and one that you have checked into source control. And if those two things are different, you've effectively failed the test and then you either need to fix the code or you reapprove that snapshot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
now we have done snapshot testing with BUnit, and we're just writing markup in there. What's different about Reverify?
So Reverify, initially when you get that text, Reverify will help you create the initial copy of that text.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it changes over time, it'll streamline the process of managing that change and approving those changes moving forward.
Okay.
And it also helps you capture a lot of state around that test that's going on. So instead of just asserting a small part of text or a small control, you can easily assert the whole HTML of a page or just the HTML of a control, and also maybe the calls that were done during the process to get the page to that state. So you can capture web requests and various other things behind the scenes.
All right. Very good.
And then all of that becomes part of the snapshot for that test.
Wow. Very cool. So it goes beyond just a snapshot of markup. It's a sort of a snapshot of all the whole context that went on behind the scenes.
Yeah, so there's the concept of converters inside Reverify, and they take in a given object and then can convert that to multiple different outputs. So when you're taking a snapshot of a web page, you pass in, as you mentioned before, Playwright. You pass in the Playwright page, and Reverify knows that the relevant bits of information for that are the HTML of the page, but also it captures the screenshot of that, and then it gives you two files to actually verify as part of that single test.
Well, I feel like saying, whoa, 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 whoa. We're going too fast here. There's a lot of stuff that we got to unpack here in this talk. So why don't you just start with the basics of Reverify, and then we'll move on to Playwright and all these other things.
Okay, well, I'll take you through the quick comparison of a traditional test compared to Reverify. So we'll just go these up side by side. Okay, so your traditional test is over here with, we have a just quick look at this is a mock effectively this is the class under test to make it easy to explain things. It's nothing special. It generates some data, and then you can have a find, or you can have a find all. There's nothing too complex about that. So over here we have a traditional assert-based approach. We want to find a person by an ID, and then we assert all the properties of that. So this would be your traditional case of querying entity framework or something.
Yeah.
And then we have a find all. And for this scenario, you'd have to go through and assert all the properties of all the returned values. Often a lot of people would just shortcut here, they'll assert that count equals 2 and then call it a day. They just delete all that because it's just too verbose to have that. So if we were moving that over to Verify, this is what those two tests now look like.
Okay. So verifier.verify is where the magic happens.
Okay, so the first time that you verify something, it's saying, so you've run this code. Verify has said that I've received this.
Yeah.
And I currently have no verified content over on the right-hand side.
Okay.
It's because this is the first time it's run. We have no approved content.
He's levitating, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay. So down here, there's a little tray icon, which is part of Verify as well. And this is just a little helper that handles asserting or abandoning, discarding different approval snapshots. And that'll become a bit more clear when I do multiple at a time. So in this case, we just have one visible, and I can just do accept it. So I click here. It's now accepted.
So now that JSON that it created becomes the standard to which to compare everything against, right?
Yep. Jeez. So you can see here that there's a file here that's convention based on the test method and the class.
Yeah.
That's the output.
.text. I like it.
Yes, it's not text because it's not technically JSON. There's a few things that we do. Yeah. It looks like JSON, but it can't be parsed as JSON. So I call it. Yeah. So there's just quick note there. You can see that both the date, time, and the GUID is scrubbed by default.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of stuff that is scrubbed and sanitized when you actually do assertions by default. You can always opt out, but that's to reduce the fragility of tests.
Sure, of course. Yeah, the things that are going to change you want to ignore, and the things that you absolutely know are going to be there, that should be there, you can test against. So how do you do that with attributes in the class? Or
so if you look at the person, Verify requires nothing about the target things you're verifying. So whatever you're passing into Verify, it doesn't need to know anything about them. So you don't need attributes. You don't need anything there.
Okay.
What it does is under the covers, it uses Newtonsoft. And when as Newtonsoft is going through and hitting a date time, it puts each of those date times in a dictionary and then does a token replace on that date time. So you can see it's GUID 1 and date time 1. When we do another one, if you do another date time, it will replace it with the same token. So that means that while you can't see the date time of a GUID, you know that they are the same date time and the same GUID that is possibly used in other locations.
So is it just GUIDs and date times, or what other things do you scrub by default? And how do you change it?
Do you want to know how to change it, or?
Yeah, like if there's a particular property of a class that I know is going to be dynamic and I don't want to include it in the test, how can I exclude that, even if it's like a string or an integer?
So you have full control over JSON.NET, so you can write a custom converter for any type.
So it's the converter that does what you're talking about.
It's the JSON converter that actually moves things between. So in a traditional approach with Newtonsoft, you're actually passing an object, and it goes through a bunch of different converters inside Newtonsoft and gets you the result. So you still have full control over that. So you can customize the serialization for any object in any way you want.
I see.
But there's also some helper methods at the top level with
scrub
customizing.
Nice.
Right, so inside here, we can now, it's weird my caps lock is locked on, that's going to be annoying. So you can actually ignore members. So we could say on person, and then you can give it and then strong type to ignore specific members.
All right, great.
Right, so there's a lot of helper methods at the top level for sanitizing data.
Nice.
Right, so if I do, ignore member and then re-verify.
So it sounds like you grokked this kind of testing and then just decided to, all of the things that you wanted in, say, B unit or X unit that weren't there for snapshot testing, you just decided to, take it as far as you possibly could, because there's a lot of stuff in Verify, a lot of extensions to work with different libraries, for example. That's really impressive.
Yeah, I took it to the furthest down I could to remove as much friction from doing snapshot testing as possible. I mean,
verify or not verify. It couldn't be easier.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that sit off that, but the majority of that's what it looks like. And all the settings that you're seeing here, you can set at the global level as well, so it's shared across all tests.
That's amazing.
But if I just take you through to rerun that second test.
Okay.
Okay, so you can see here that the date time 2 and good 2 are different. So you can see that they're counting up, and if they're reused, you'd see them again.
Right.
And I'll just reapprove that one so we get back to a clean state. So if we come into the actual builder and let's say change the result, so we're effectively changing the behavior of the code under test. So we've changed the test. We now want to, this is where the fragility will come in, because if you're asserting, just date times, you wouldn't see this stuff. But if we run these now, so in a traditional assert, you'd have to go and change the asserts if you were asserting that particular value.
Right.
But in this case, you can come in and you can see exactly the change.
Oh, good.
Now you can see that it's popping up for every test that you have, it's popping up a diff tool. Mm-hmm. Now we can just approve all of those, accept them all, and it automatically closes those tools. If we just jump over now to Blazor test.
Yeah.
So this solution has, ignore the server project. We'll just focus on the web for now.
Yeah.
This is the default web app, Blazor web app that comes out of Visual Studio.
Okay.
So we can see in here, you've got a component. So this is actually testing the increment count.
Mm-hmm.
So we're actually calling this method, incrementing the count, and we want to verify the result, which is a component.
Yeah.
Or it's a render result from a component. So when we run that for the first time.
What was that stuff?
I already had approved files, so I just wanted to show you the first run.
Oh, okay.
Case.
So you deleted the approved text files.
Yeah. So now we get, so for one test, we got 2 files.
Yep.
So you can see by default it's captured the size of a component. Mm-hmm. This is the model, which didn't expose any public property, so there's nothing to see there.
Yeah. And
then it actually captured the text. And you can see that the count was incremented to 1.
Yeah.
So that's the actual rendered HTML of that page.
That's nice. And, as opposed to doing it with B unit, where I'm going to have to figure out what that HTML is and statically put that in there for each test.
Yeah, and you can imagine where you're having, you might, for a given component, you might have 20 or 30 tests.
Oh, yeah.
Now, if you change one bit of HTML,
right,
and you're asserting that in a traditional manner, you've got to go and, touch all of those asserts.
Even in a snapshot test with B unit, you still have to have, for each test, you have to statically list all of the HTML that is in the expected output. So you don't have to do that here.
No, it captures the whole thing and you're done. And then there's actually a keyboard shortcut, which I can start to use from now. For me, I've got this wired up to Control Alt A. So that means approve all of the snapshots.
Nice.
So if I just do Control-Alt-A, it'll just see them disappear. And behind the scenes, those files are now approved.
Wow. Excellent.
So the B-unit context, so this is just a B-unit test, a traditional B-unit test for comparison.
Right.
So we're testing two things. Server, which is the same thing, because from the B-unit perspective, you're rendering pretty much the same context out. In this case, it's just finding a individual node and verifying that node.
Right.
So this is kind of this trade-off in traditional asserts where if you assert too much, the test becomes fragile.
Right.
But if you don't assert enough, something might change under the covers that you didn't expect.
Right. It's not robust enough.
Yeah, so if you change the component in such a way that something outside this P changed, this test would still pass.
Right.
So Verify it understands not just Blazor raw, it also understands B-unit.
Cool.
So in this case, we're rendering the component, we're finding the button and doing a click. This is a traditional assert that doesn't have to be there.
Right, yeah, I was going to say, those don't have to be there.
And then the result is the full output.
So cool, so cool.
Now, the reason why both raw Blazor and B-unit are supported is that inside here, so this is raw Blazor with Verify.
Right. Yeah.
This is B-unit with Blazor.
Yep.
The fantastic thing about B-unit is it simulates a browser.
Right.
Right. It's got some things like similar to CSS selectors where you can pick and choose different things and execute actions on a button. So click a button, for example. So that's what's happening over here.
But that comes from a separate thing, right? Angle sharp.
It does, but that's part of B-unit.
Yeah.
B-unit references those things and gives helpers for those things.
Right.
Right. And it marries all that stuff together.
Yep.
If you're talking Verify with raw Blazor, it doesn't support that. You'd have to manually pull in that stuff from Angle Sharp yourself and do it. So that's why both raw Blazor and B-unit are supported. You're limited with raw Blazor. This is actually executing a method on the model because it's strong typed.
Right.
But with B-unit, we can actually assert that the binding is correct.
Yep.
Right. So we can ensure that this button is actually wired to the increment count and actually has a result.
Wow, that's cool.
So it's trade-offs between them. So B-unit is a little bit slow because it does a little bit slower, not noticeably slower than raw, but it's more powerful.
Yeah, so I get Verify, and I agree. I get that this is a very superior snapshot testing framework. I really was intrigued by, and I learned this from looking at your pull request for Blazor sliders, that you're using Playwright, and that's WRIGHT. The original Playwright was, I think, JavaScript, right? And then there's a Playwright.net that works with C#, right?
I think there's multiple implementations now. I'm not sure of a full list, but there's Playwright.net. And you can think of that as the equivalent of Selenium.
Yeah, it's like effectively Selenium light, kind of.
Yeah. The reason I chose Playwright for doing most of my stuff is that it handles a lot of the acquiring of the browser for you. Mm-hmm. With Selenium, you've got to kind of faff around with making sure that stuff is installed correctly on the machine, where Playwright, you can just say, just download it for me. And it handles that for multiple browsers. Right.
So if you're lost listening to this, end-to-end testing is what we're talking about. So we're talking, if you don't know what Selenium is, this is sort of like the de facto end-to-end web testing tool. What it does, and Playwright does the same thing, but it has some cooler features, is that it loads up either in a window or without a window. So it can be headless, it's called, if you don't see anything. It loads up the equivalent of the Chromium, Edge, or WebKit browser. Chromium, WebKit, or what's the other one? Mozilla?
Yes.
Yeah. One of those three, which is the basic browser engines. And it will execute and load your web page, and then you can find elements, manipulate elements. You can fill in inputs all in code. and I believe Playwright.net has the feature that it will wait for a particular element, by selector to be available before moving on. So if the website is slow, let's say you push a button and you're waiting for, something that says, yes, okay, you've just purchased, a new home, whatever it is. Congratulations. You can actually wait until that element shows up and then you can inspect it.
That's correct, yeah. It's particularly useful when we're talking Blazor WebAssembly because that first load and render takes a while. So you can effectively wait till a given element inside the known content of that Blazor app is actually rendered, and then it will start running your test.
Do you have anything where we could demo Playwright.net with Verify?
Yeah. Yep.
Well, we do.
So just for the difference here is that with those past few tests we were playing with, the output was text and HTML.
Yeah.
But at no point was it running that in a real browser. So your JavaScript wasn't executing. There was no render.
Right.
You weren't asserting that different rendering between different browsers was correct.
Yeah.
So this is where Playwright comes in. So there's a couple of things with Playwright. One is you want to wire it up because Playwright is expensive to start up. You want to launch, get that Playwright browser up and going once and share that state across multiple tests. So that's what this test fixture is.
So this text fixture, is this just in your testing app? So is this part of hooking into the unit test Explorer or Test Explorer, or is this a separate project?
So this is inside my personal project. So people would copy this into their project and manipulate it how they want. So
it could be
from my perspective. No, this sits inside your unit test project.
Okay, so it is inside your unit test project. Okay,
yep.
Cool.
Yep. So this, if you have a look here, just starts a Playwright. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of the Playwright instance. We launch a browser. In this case, we're using Chrome. You could launch other browsers or multiple browsers in the same context.
Yep.
And then in this case, I'm reusing a single page. So I'll launch that page and set the resolution.
Nice. That's important because a lot of what you're testing here is, hey, at this resolution, can I see this element, right? Is it visible? Is it off the screen? Does it, you can't see it, of course, unless you're not headless, but.
Yeah, you can also imagine some different vectors here where you'd be having a matrix of different tests with different resolutions. Yeah. So given a given test, you want to verify that for each of the three browsers, it renders in 5 or 6 different resolutions.
Right. Brilliant.
The other thing that we do here is because it's an integration test, I want to actually run my real instance. Yes. So in this case, I derive the path to my web app and I actually do a .NET run. So this is a full-on integration test.
Yeah.
And that'll actually start the web app up behind the scenes.
Yep.
You won't see it, but it'll be running.
Now there is a headless option, right? When you start it. You're starting with the process, but I think in Playwright there's a headless thing.
So this is my Blazor web app. This isn't Playwright.
Yeah.
So I'm actually starting up the instance of my Blazor app, and I'm starting up Playwright, and then I'll tell Playwright to talk to that app.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
You can use you can start ASP.NET websites in memory.
Right.
But it doesn't really make much difference here because all the code's running in the
browser.
In the browser anyway. So the actual code inside the server side of this isn't significant.
Right.
So once we have that fixture, we can inject for each test, inject the page, and then run a test. So I'll just run it through the first time. So I'll just delete what I've got verified.
Right.
Just to show you that first run again. Now the difference here is that the only drawback with doing browser headless automation tests is they're slower.
Yeah, sure.
It's on I've got a laptop. you're talking a couple of seconds to start Playwright, and you're talking, in the hundreds of millisecond range to render each page.
Right.
So you don't want to be running your full matrix of tests on every single build locally.
Upgrade your machine.
But doing a full run. Yeah, upgrade your machine. But sometimes if you have thousands of tests, you might want to run them on a nightly build or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
So here's our result. So we had 2 tests. One is doing the full page render.
Yep.
Another one is just finding the content and rendering that element. So you can see here's our full page.
And so it took snapshots of those.
Yep.
Is that something that you're doing, or is it something Playwright's doing?
So Verify has the capability of understanding what to do with images, but the actual image in this case, Playwright has an API that talks to the actual underlying browser API. So this is effectively a browser snapshot from Chrome that Playwright has routed through to us.
Nice.
So you're using the true snapshot technology of the browser.
So this is what you did with Blazor sliders to create the sort of the documentation, the pictures, if you will. Yeah.
So the cool side effect of this is now for all of those different tests that you run, you have a file that you can show someone that's an image.
Yeah.
So for all the different scenarios, your BA comes to you with some kind of scenario about, I want it to look at like this under this case. You can write a test for that, and you can render the exact page or component and show them the image of how it will actually look on multiple browsers.
Right.
It also means that you've got those images to push into documentation if you need to.
Sure.
That are always up to date.
Yep.
Right, because every time you run the tests, if the content has changed, you'll have to re-verify the images and they'll be recreated.
Yeah.
Cool. So
you can
see here we've got 4 because we actually capture the HTML.
Yep. Brilliant.
This is our single control that we've found, and the HTML for our single control.
Nice.
And I can just approve all of those, and we're all good.
Control.
So that's just
A.
Well, it's up to you. That's
what you did.
That's my setting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we now go and
let's make it fail.
New app, right? Current counter.
Yeah.
I don't know why my cap locks is stuck on, but who cares? Okay, so now let's go back into our test. You'll actually find that if you're running this against Blazor server, it is a bit faster to start up because it doesn't need to load all that stuff in.
Yeah, Blazor server is faster.
Yep. Now there's an interesting difference here is that notice it's only brought up the text.
Okay.
Right, it hasn't changed the snapshots.
Right.
So I did this on purpose because one of the problems with image snapshots is when you run it on different operating systems or particularly on your CI server, there's often, slight pixel differences that you don't really want to fail a test on. So in my case, I've actually got this is another feature of Verify. This is actually an image comparer, and it's doing a lossy comparison of the 2 images. So you can dial this comparison up and down based on how generous you want to be to the differences in 2 images and still have the match.
Nice. Image magic is something that I saw was in the stack that you installed for Blazor sliders. So is that a separate thing? Where does that come from?
So a different category of add-ins for Verify is called comparers. So you can have a comparer for Word documents, you can have a comparer for PNGs, and you can have a comparer for any different file type that you want.
And so somebody wrote a comparer called Image Magic?
I wrote the comparer. So the comparer for Verify Image Magic takes the lossy comparison functionality of Image Magic and makes that consumable by Verify.
Oh, so cool.
Okay, so we'll just delete that now and we'll rerun those tests.
Okay.
So this will be doing a pixel perfect comparison.
Simon, this is amazing. Seriously. I was always loath to do unit testing and test-driven development just because of all the extra work that's involved. And, of course, when I'm on a project and they're doing tests and all that stuff, of course, I'm doing it. But it just seems like that this kind of snapshot testing, and especially with a tool like Verify, just takes a whole lot of stuff away and still gives you the fine-grained control that you need over tests. But you just don't have to do all that work.
And it's good to point out that it doesn't need to be on its own. You can still use asserts. That's fine.
Right.
You can assert certain stuff of your model and then do a snapshot of other parts of a model. Yeah.
It's whatever's working.
So here you can see how cool the difference is. So you can see on our left-hand side, rendering's a bit off, but you can see that it's received the ER. I'll just zoom in a bit.
Yeah, that looks better, yeah.
Yep. So you can see that the received has the ER, the count doesn't, and then you can actually see in the diff, it highlights the differences in red.
Wow. Cool.
So that's functionality beyond compare, but
absolutely.
Verify supports I think it's about 15 different comparison tools. So it will detect what comparison tools, diff tools are installed on your system, and it will launch them based on file type. So if you have a certain diff tool that works better for JPEGs and another diff tool that works better for text, it will know which one to use and launch for different tools. So you might get two different tools launched for one test.
All right. So let's say that I've got an application already written, right? It's a Blazor application. Let's say just for the sake of argument that it's a Blazor server app. Okay. Let's say that.
Yep.
And I want to do some tests to make sure that, everything is going to work before I run this. Would you start with, it doesn't seem like I would start with fine-grained unit tests. I would probably start with some end-to-end tests, with testing some user scenarios. Would you agree that that's probably a good place to start, or would you start just going through every single object and doing unit tests for those?
Yeah, so there's two scenarios there. If you're starting with a new app, and I think a lot of people, when they start with Blazor, are probably using the template that comes with Visual Studio.
Right.
So when I did this test scenario to demonstrate to you, I created the web app, I created the server app, and the first thing I did was the full integration test.
Right.
And the reason for that is when you're tweaking things about how it renders, changing ports, changing how it starts up to make sure it's all compatible with different tooling, that end-to-end integration test will capture a whole bunch of stuff ups that you do.
So you're talking about with Verify and Playwright, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
And similarly, if you're trying to adapt this to an existing project, having those integration tests, it's just so much easier to set up. Right. Because all you need is a running instance of a web page.
Right.
And you can actually snapshot those. Now, in my case, I'm starting up what's built locally, but it doesn't have to be that way. You could actually write some tests that go off and assert that's something that's currently deployed to an integration environment. Right. So you've got something actually deployed there and running and working.
Right.
You can walk through X number of pages, snapshot all of those, and then rerun that scenario after each time you do a deploy.
So there's a big difference here, and you said it before, but I want to reiterate it, which is, in traditional assert testing, you're creating mocks to sort of fill in the blanks with known data so you can test against that mock data. With integration testing, end-to-end testing, such as you're doing with snapshots here, what you can do is run it against the real data and use and pull up records that are known that aren't going to change. And then for the things that are going to change, you can exclude those fields from the JSON that is going to be created. And you don't have to go through every single object property and test things. You just tell it which things are going to change. So you're going to ignore those. And then you've got like one line of code. What is it? Verifier.verify.
It does reduce the fragility.
Yeah.
I mean, often mocks are introduced to avoid the fragility of, production style data.
Sure.
And with snapshot testing combined with scrubbing, it means that you can fairly trivially remove that fragility and just focus on the things that you actually want to be correct.
And this is something that I said last week, which is, when you have the ability to exclude, you could say, ignore this element, ignore that. It's kind of like, you don't have to go to extreme mocking to do the same. It's the opposite way. Yeah.
Even with Playwright, like when you're capturing a real image, so if you're running across real production, a real integration website or production for that matter, when you take those snapshots, there can be some unstable stuff in the snapshots. So, for example, let's say you have a date time on your in actual HTML. So that will be captured through to the actual image that comes through. But the good thing about Playwright is it has full query selector support, which means you can come in, find whatever elements that you actually want to scrub before you do the snapshot.
Yeah.
Right. And you can set the content of those to be wiped out.
Wow.
So you could hide the date time element so that when you take a snapshot, that doesn't show up and doesn't break your test.
Wow. Excellent.
Right. So it is very, very versatile in terms of playing around with that stuff.
I feel like we're just scratching the surface, and I want to know where I can learn more. Where can I learn more, Simon?
That's the homepage.
Okay.
So it's just Verify tests/Verify.
Yeah. Great.
And if you're curious about the different extensions that we have, you can see there's a whole variety there.
Raven, SQL Server, Uno, Xamarin, WinForms, and Service Bus.
While we're here, I'll show you one other concept that we've got. So let's say we have a test.
Yeah.
That is, it's just querying a table and getting the value and returning the value from that table.
Okay.
So one of the problems with that is how do you check what that's doing under the covers? You can assert the result, but that just gives you an int. You don't know if it's doing, full table scans. You don't know if it's doing joins or what the actual result is.
Right.
So there's a feature called SQL recording where just before you actually call your method, you call SQL recording, and then the result will actually contain the full SQL that was actually called.
Awesome.
Right, so this thing resulted in two files. It gave you the target, and the result was 42. It gave you the raw SQL that was there, but it also
gave you the SQL that was executed.
Yeah.
I love it.
And if you actually pass in a connection to this, right, if I just get rid of that file and rerun this one. So this is actually doing, I've got my script that creates my database up here.
Yeah.
If I actually pass a SQL connection into Verify, what do you think the default behavior should be?
If you just pass the connection?
Yeah.
Verify that the connection was made.
Not exactly. It will make sure the connection's valid, but it will actually, when it finishes,
will it connect and tell you if it connected or not?
I think my Visual Studio's, oh no, there we go. So what it's done is that it has actually verified the full schema of the database for you.
Wow.
So this we've found useful when you're evolving databases forward, particularly in Entity Framework. You're not necessarily keeping a good eye on what the resultant SQL schema looks like. Without to go and actually understand it, you've got to go and crack open the SQL tooling and have a look at the actual tables.
Right.
So this is quite useful when you're making changes. You can actually visualize those change sets inside the SQL script.
Wow.
And it also allows you to have conversations with DBAs saying, okay, in our next release, you can do a diff between the two files in source control. So this gets checked into source control. You say, this is our last release. We'll diff it with the new release. And it will give you the diff of what changed to that database, and also optionally get you the scripts that would be executed in your production database.
You mentioned source control, and one of the features of Verify has to do with source control, in that things that are validated are checked into source control, and things that are not validated or verified are not. Just to briefly explain that.
So when we validate a file and assert it, you want to ensure that file, it's effectively, you've moved your assert logic into a file, and you want to check that file into source control. So by default, most people's Git rules will allow the verified file to be put into source control, but what you have to go in and do is exclude the received file. So when a test fails, you'll get a temporary received file. And sometimes if you revert that change and you don't rerun the test because the test will now pass, the received file will still exist.
So the received file is generated when a test fails. A verified file will happen when a test is verified.
Yep. So once we first run something, here we go. So you can see, because I haven't approved that or accepted that change, we have verified file, which is empty, and the received file.
Yeah.
Right. And you don't want to check this in accidentally, because this is kind of we're in this temporary state of, you haven't accepted the change.
Right.
And the received file's over here. So you just want to avoid checking them in.
I get it. Yeah, you only want the verified files, whether they're empty or not, to be checked in. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, if they're empty, it's generally a stuff up. You probably needed to rerun the test. So if I just, accept all those, the received file goes away. Yeah, and the verified file's here.
Brilliant. Simon, thank you very much. We're running out of time. I just want to thank you again and for contributing to Blazor Sliders, and I'm looking forward to more.
Yep. I'm glad to be on the show. I'm glad I could help. And if anyone wants, demos of this kind of stuff, or they want to write extensions for it, please reach out.
Boom. That's it. All right. Thanks. And back to you in the studio, Carl. The thing about Verify is that it's fairly new. Not a lot of people know about it yet. And that's where you come in. Even if you don't have time to check it out yourself, please blog about it and share this video. Oh, and speaking of videos, I'm adding a new show to my workload. It's called The .NET Show. Topics will be more general, and I promise not to leave anyone behind. I'll be splitting my time between episodes of Blazor Train and the .NET Show, so go check it out at thenetshow.com. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blazor Train!